Hey everyone, today I want to talk about what I do to write for more than, or only write for one instrument in FL Studio. So for example, if you were writing for a MIDI keyboard, I actually have two little versions of the short loop that I did for my good friend Eben Frosty's animated series Mash Dash, which is in the description. I'm going to play both of them and then talk about how I did them, because there isn't that much of a difference technically, so I'm going to talk about how I did the first one and then talk about differences between the first one and the second one. Here's the first one. So if I open up the pattern for the first one, the first thing you'll notice is that I have three different channels for the piano and not just one. Because if you were picking up a piano or a harpsichord with a stereo microphone, you would get the bass slightly to one side and the melody slightly to another side. So for comparison, here's everything in the middle channel. No, not that. I think that sounds cheap compared to and you can see that I balanced the levels a bit. You can do that by ear. Another thing I did is that the volume envelopes for all three are slightly different, because a good pianist, like a professional level concert pianist, would be able to play these parts slightly differently. I wanted the melody to stand out, so I made it a little bit more plucky, and I didn't put any release on it, whereas I have a little bit of release on the bass and more release on the middle voices. I do think that you need some release on anything that's supposed to sound like a piano for it to sound not cheap. So if I solo the middle voices, I don't normally like release. I think that it can interfere with the harmony too much if you have a lot of changing chords, and the sort of overlapping doesn't always sound good. But in a situation like this, I think that you really need it. And I didn't do anything to these individual tracks. I assigned these to a different mixer track and put a little bit of compressor on the middle voices, just because the dynamics in the melody and the bass are the most important, and it makes sense to have those less static. I connected those all to the piano, but then decided to do everything on the master because I'm a hypocrite. It's pretty standard EQ. I have a normal tone shaping EQ, and then here, this thing, I just didn't like that one frequency. Just trying to take out a little bit of that twang. Compressor, reverb number 1, which you'll notice is at 20%, and then Maximus I'm really just using for stereo separation. So I'm going to essentially make this again. I'm gonna set this to default and go to bands, and I think this was at like 100, and this was at 0, and this was at like 2K. you really just have to go by ear. So if I'd solo each of these bands, where it kind of stops becoming a grumble, mid should be where most of the song is. And then high is just sort of overtones. So even though the bass is panned, it's always good to have the lowest frequencies in the center. And I brought out the mids and the highs just a little bit more. This patcher here is just a mid-side EQ, so if you go to add plugin, there should be a stereo shaper somewhere around here. So if I click this and just do a mid side splitter and then click this and outputs send to, it's basically the same thing. So I can delete this guy and this will send to stereo, and this will send to mono. Other way around, this is stereo. So if I X this out, just bring out the high frequencies a little bit more on the sides. And this is my main reverb, but oftentimes when I record something that doesn't have any microphones, I like to have a super realistic reverb along the middle frequencies, so no early reflection and at a very low level. This seems like it was at 4%, diff all the way up. So if I just show you what that sounds like by turning the dry down and the wet up, it sounds very realistic, whereas this is meant to complement and not really be as realistic. So I'll do the same thing for the other reverb, just so you can hear the difference with having, you know, a bigger size and a lower diffusion. And did I have any early reflections on this? I didn't, but that would have also made it sound less realistic. And just for the shits and giggles, that early reflection just sort of adds more. Reflections. So I'm going to bring that back down to, it was at around 20. And that's mostly it. So I'm going to talk about the other version quickly. So a couple things I did, because I wanted this to sound more realistic. I used multiple piano samples. If I used the same piano sample throughout, I found that it sounded very distorted the more I pitched it, because it was just that one note being recorded and then pitched up and down. I just kind of experimented before I found that this A sounded good for the upper and middle voices. And then I had to EQ it a little more to blend for whatever reason. It turns out I didn't really use this EQ. But really sure the bass EQ is doing anything either, but the melody EQ I found really helped it not clash with the middle voices even though it's the same sample. So and now if I try doing that without, that just sounds a little harsher to me. I don't feel like they'd blend as well if they're both sonically very similar. I did some release to the melodies so it sounds more piano-y, and that's it. These two recordings are both very similar, so that's how I dealt with my MIDI piano loop. Thank you guys so much for watching. For any audio work or soundtracking or anything else, check out my socials in the description.